Hey, I'm Coach T. This is my C Sharp DevLog for week 23. We are almost at the 6 month mark now for learning and documenting my 1 year of study of C Sharp. So this week we're going to talk about staircasing complexity because it's something that I've been using very proactively in the Unity progress. I don't want the devlog to become entirely about the Unity stuff because I'm still learning C Sharp outside of Unity. And I'm still engaging in the Reddit communities for learning C Sharp. But at some point, maybe after this, the year is over, I'll switch over and we'll do logging 1 year of work or something on a Unity project. But so yeah, I'm going to talk about staircasing complexity because that's what I've been working with for the last week. I'm going to show off some progress that I made with using audio effects that I bought. I have the commercial and private rights to them. But I've got audio effects now in a Unity game, gunshots basically. There might be music too, but again, I did buy the rights. I bought the license to use the sound effects that I'm going to play in this. So hopefully it won't be an issue for however YouTube manages like the DCMA or whatever it is. But yeah, so what I did over the last like 2 weeks is I started to build these one-page documents of what do I want to build into the Unity project, which is not very different from how I was scaling complexity into the console apps that I was building, whether it was taking in a CSV and ripping data off of it and doing some work with Link and then exporting it to a JSON that I could read elsewhere, or if it was running a timer and then every time I hit the spacebar, it logs like one interruption from a kid while a teacher's lesson is running, that kind of thing. I was really looking at each one of these projects as a micro project. And I've seen that a couple times now on the game dev or the Unity subreddits talking about using micro projects to learn. And I actually think it's a really, really good way to go about learning. And I know from channel engagement that I've got a lot of other learners that follow along with me, which is what I want. I think that's great. And I love to be helpful. I'm a teacher by nature. I'm a teacher by calling. I'm a coach. Thus the name of the channel, right? So I thought this was an appropriate topic to talk about. So why am I using micro projects? Well, first of all, if you watch or read debriefs of why did my project fail, one of the most common, I wouldn't say the most number one reason, but one of the most common reasons that people cite that their projects fail is because of scope creep. Scope creep is when you have this idea and it gets bigger and it gets bigger and it gets bigger and it gets bigger and you can't ever actually reach the end. It's kind of like if you're playing football and they keep moving the goalposts back, right? Then you're never actually going to get to the end of the field and score a touchdown. You need to have a firm endpoint, no scope creep. So by building these, I guess you might call it a game design document, but it's basically a checklist of minimal features that I want to have before I allow myself to move on to the next project. And then I also include over on the right a little space to document. So it's kind of the Cornell Notes version of a game dev doc, I guess. The idea, or like a game design doc. So the core idea for the project that I finished that I'm going to show off today, it was built all down here on the big PC over the last week, is that you need to be able to use a twin stick control scheme to move around with. It needs to feel snappy. I need to utilize ray casting to build a rudimentary shooter system that uses multiple weapons. I got that working, but I ended up, I have this like a side note where the way that I built my weapon prefabs makes it very difficult to swap them the way that I wanted to. So in the one I'm building upstairs on the laptop, I approached that problem from a very different angle because I had identified it as a problem in my construction with this one. So I'll show off how that works. I think next week I'll have enough progress on the other one to show it off. But basically, I'm keeping notes on my progress and then identifying struggle points and trying to brainstorm over the course of the week how would I solve that in my next project. I needed to be able to use ray casting to do some particle effect stuff like showing off impacts, thruster smoke, ray casting hit input, stuff like that. I didn't do a main menu. That was something, it was a secondary non-main priority. So I wanted to play with menus, but ultimately I decided it was a distraction from working on the gameplay loop. I laid out my controls. So the left stick needs to control movement. The right stick needs to control rotation. That was very hard for me to figure out, but I got there. I watched many different tutorials, and I think I built 7 different systems using those tutorials before I found one that made sense to me and that I was able to modify in the way that I really wanted it to work with. Left and right trigger needed to do things. I wanted to have melee working, but I ran into an issue with my enemy prefabs where they tip over. So technically the melee system works, but there's no rigid body on the enemies. When I stick a rigid body on them, it works. So the rough idea is there, but I didn't know at the time that the way that I was building the enemies was going to cause them to tip over. So that's something I could probably solve by changing the colliders. But again, I kind of hit that minimal viable product for identifying here's the basics of what I wanted to do. And now I'm going to implement those into a new project. So it's that staircase of complexity. At this stage, I was able to do this. At this stage, I'm going to do it this way. Next time, maybe I'll add in an animated character, something like that. I figured out how to have shields and take damage. I put on very basic UI for it. And I worked on the drop pod deployment mechanics. So I'll show you what it looks like here. I'm going to turn the desktop audio down a little bit because I'm concerned it may be way too loud. But if we flip over, this is where the UI lays. It's the old UI system. I didn't want to monkey with the new one yet. I know it's in UHML or something like that and USS. So it's basically HTML and CSS in Unity. Thankfully, I know both of those, or at least I know the basics to intermediate level of both of those. So when I was reading how it works, I was like, oh, I get it. But it is its own tool set, and I want to be familiar with the Unity tool set before I start learning another thing. So therefore, basic Unity canvas. We have one level here. You can see the blue is where the nav mesh is working. That was another thing on here, was that the enemies needed to utilize the nav mesh to work. They needed to react. So if you shoot them, most of the time they have a flag on there that's called is pissed, and they will chase after you. It doesn't work 100% of the time. And I think that might be because if you hit their nose cone, let me zoom in on one of these guys. I think if you're hitting the nose cone, then it doesn't trigger it, but generally it does trigger it. They're very rudimentary enemy, and you can see here, if I click onto this, this is the nav mesh agent thing, but the actual collider on Fastboy is this box collider, so they just tip over if I apply a rigid body, which I don't want. So the new ones, I have a model I think I'm going to use, even if it's not animated. I think I'm going to use a capsule collider on them so that they can't tip over, which should allow me to use a rigid body, which should allow me to have realistic physics, and therefore use the melee. I think. That's how I worked it out in my head. We'll find out over the next week or so if it works. Player is still just the pillboy. I recentered the gun so that there was a kind of a strange offset that made it hard to shoot long distances. There's a little ball here that acts as an aiming target until I put a proper ball onto, or a proper reticle. But I'm not doing it in this project because I met the bare minimums. I want to move on. There are structural issues I don't want to work around because I'm just learning. Staircase of complexity. I am midway on the stair. I'm not actually at the top of the staircase yet. And then I've got some like general crappy terrain that I put in that I made very quickly in Blender. So the idea is they can navigate anywhere where it's blue. They will intelligently navigate around. There's some issues with the speed, where the speed is way too fast when they approach me. But again, I'm learning the basics. Every new iteration should be more complicated. So I'll go ahead and give it a play. I don't have my controller down here, so we're going to be using PC controls. Busy. Well, okay, so I'll keep talking. The other thing that I did for the first time in Unity is I used an interface on the new project, and that's part of the staircasing of complexity. So because my gun script didn't work, I built scripts for revolvers and then for firearms, but I found out when I tried to swap them that it didn't work right. I'm using an interface now, and the interface on the new script, it just takes any game weapon, and it has an attack and a reload function. So anytime that I want to swap weapons, how do I even do that in this one? I don't remember how to do it in this one because it's been a couple days. There's a way to do it. It's one of these keys. When you swap weapons, it loads the new game object, but the player controller script just calls fire on whatever the current weapon is, or it calls attack on whatever the current weapon is. And I know using the interface that any object that has the attack feature, or any object that has a game weapon script attached to it is going to have an attack or a reload. And so I can do it without really worrying what the game object is. So I know months ago at this point, like a month, 2 months ago, I was like, what is an interface? I don't understand the point of this. Got it. Practical process helps everything. So if I shoot, you can see it comes flying at you. I got to figure out how to reduce the speed. They have like 5 hit points. If you 1, 2, 3, I must be missing. Oh, look, you can kind of see the impact effect. Let me shoot the wall. You can see the impact effect there. Zoom in. Right? If I hit Q, it reloads. Oop. So you can move around. The camera is a Cinemachine camera that I set up. It follows pretty intelligently. Does a pretty good job. Yeah, see, he's not as pissed. He's not coming at me. So that's me learning the state machine, excuse me, for the enemies. Yeah, they'll come at me. He is pissed now. Whee! And I think that's it. I think there's only like the 5 or 6 enemies on the board. But this is the general idea. I know I showed off a little bit of it last week, but there's more functionality now, which is what I had promised. And the new one, the controls are way better. It flips whether or not you're playing with a controller or a PC. It flips intelligently. And then you can play it one-handed on a controller. The keyboard requires both a keyboard and a mouse. But on a controller, you can technically play the game one-handed, just with this. But if you do put any input in from the right stick, it then overrides that direction to allow you to strafe. The new controller is way better. I spent the better part of a day and a half working on it. It can jump. This one can't jump. Oh, is that switching weapons? Oh, it's reporting what it's doing down here. E is melee. Q doesn't seem to do anything. Tab is switching weapons. Yeah. So next week I'm going to have more to show off in a new Staircase of Complexity micro project. This one is called Project Boston. It was the second of these shooter micro prototypes that I'm building. The new one is called Project Rochester, naming them after cities in the region. Project Rochester has a much longer laundry list of things that I want to accomplish. Like, now that I know how to do that, get the muzzle flash and the impact, I want to shoot a cartridge out the side of the gun as well. I think that would be neat. Just one, and I need to work on tracer rounds, because it's a little bit hard to see what you're aiming at if you only have this little bubble, especially if you're on controller. So there are things that I want to improve, but this is the idea: is I spend a couple days or a week or 2 weeks working on a micro project, learn a whole bunch, gain practical context, then rebuild it better in a more optimized fashion the next time around. One thing I probably will not rebuild, though, is the controller scheme that I have going for Project Rochester. I really like it. It uses the new input system. It uses delegates. Maybe it subscribes and unsubscribes with the observer pattern, bare minimum, depending on what's going on. And that allows me to have a whole bunch of flexibility in the controls. I was able to remap them based on some feedback from my buddy. So I'm pretty proud of that, but it also is very complicated. It took me almost all day yesterday to program it so that it works the right way, including if you hold tilde on the keyboard, which nothing happens on this one, but it zooms out temporarily, and if you let it go, it zooms in. So you get more of a battlefield focus, so you can shoot farther more accurately. So that's kind of it. I don't have any other features built into this one. I might have a different scene on this file. Let me see. We need to go to our project. We need to go to scenes. Let's look at drop scenes. Oh yeah, okay. So this is another one that I was working on, playing with particle effects in particular. I'm almost done. I ran a little long this week, but show off. Got some music. Can't control anything. There's not really gameplay elements here, but it does that, which I think is kind of cool. The idea was to learn to use ray casting to detect how close to the ground that the object was. And then if it was within a certain range, then fire out a particle system, which are the two thrusters, right? And then those particle systems also ray trace outward to figure out logically, based on their trajectory, where the smoke effects would be. So I didn't study shaders or anything like that. It was literally just couple of simple ray traces and particle systems to effect a little bit of a visual event there. And then in theory, I would take that, replace that cube drop pod with my actual model drop pod. And then we would probably hit enter or space or click to spawn the player, deactivate the drop pod controls or unsubscribe from them, and then subscribe to the player controls, like on enable, and then you'd be able to control the player on this goofy piece of terrain that I threw together. So yeah, that's it. It was a busy week for programming. I worked in the mornings a lot because I shifted my gym schedule a little bit. So I was working at like 5:30 to 6:30 a.m. for 3 or 4 days straight. And then we had an unexpected snow day on Friday. So I had time to work during the day. You know, I split the time between the girls and work downstairs. So I accomplished basically all of what Project Boston needed to do. I, in my naivety, thought that I could do what I call the first one, Albany, then Boston, and then move on to the game that I wanted to build. But I see now how important that staircase of complexity is. So it might be months before I'm actually working on the thing that I really want to build. But each one of these has gotten subsequently more interesting. And I think it might even be time for me to go back to the Udemy tutorial, because there's stuff on like animating a character. I have character models that I could use that I've designed. I could animate them. They're rigged and everything. I'll throw one here up on the screen. But I don't necessarily have the knowledge of how to store the animations. Let's see. Yeah, so here he is. So, just a quick little show off, I guess. But, like, it would be very cool to have this bad boy animated, and being able to interact in a game. This is a dummy used for some sketches and some basic book layout work that I do. If you've been watching the Affinity Publisher tutorial playlist, you'll know I mentioned working on the game books. Well, this is one that I've used for some sketch work. So it's another one of those weird skills that I have. I can do some basic 3D modeling. That's something that the Udemy courses go through. So I'm thinking it might be time to go back to that, but that's maybe for the next project beyond the project. What am I calling this one? Project Syracuse? Yeah, no. Project Rochester, which is the one with the improved shooting mechanics. So yeah, whatever. I'm having fun. We're closing in on 6 months. I don't know when I'm going to make the final decision, if I'm going to stick with this long term or if I'm just going to call it that was a fun excursion, go to ASP. But right now, I am having fun. I'm doing what I thought I'd be able to do. And so right now, it seems kind of rosy. But that's it. I'm going to get upstairs and go see if the girls are up from their nap. And Bills are on today with the Lions. So if you're tuning into that, go Bills. But also, much love to our Lake Erie bros. And I will see you next weekend. Do something cool this week.